Hey everyone! Have you ever thought that Hoenn's selection of Pokemon could have been just a little bit better? Like, have you ever played through Hoenn and thought, this Pokemon should have probably been in this region? I mean, it's a good fit for this region, right? I think we've all kind of thought that a little bit. So, today I am going to be looking at the Hoenn Pokédex to determine which Pokemon could have been available in Hoenn at the time of the game's creation, and I'm going to be making some changes to the Hoenn Pokédex, so stay tuned. I'm Sabrina, and you're watching Saffron City TV. Welcome back, everyone. So when I was a kid, I really enjoyed the fact that Hoenn was based on a tropical region, but I was also kind of bummed that certain Pokemon from previous generations didn't exactly make their way into this region that probably is really well suited to them. And I think some of you agree, so today I am going to be doing an overhaul of the Hoenn Pokédex. But first, let's go over the rules on how I intend to overhaul Hoenn's Pokédex, shall we? Rule number 1, I won't be going over the national dex. I'll only be discussing the Hoenn Pokédex specifically, and I won't be including Pokemon that didn't exist prior to the generation of the game being discussed. I'll be discussing the Gen 3 Pokédex first, specifically the Emerald Dex. Gen 6 will follow, and finally, in the bonus round, I'll be looking at Pokemon from all of the generations to discuss Pokemon that would also be a great fit for Hoenn, but wouldn't be swapped out in the Pokédex. But that means that when overhauling the Gen 3 Dex, only Pokemon from Gens 1 and 2 can be considered for the overhaul since Gen 4 Pokemon didn't exist yet. And the same goes for Gen 6, with the allowance of Pokemon from Gens 1 through 6 as replacement options. That's right, you heard me correctly, replacement options. That's because rule number 2 is that I'm not going to just be adding Pokemon to these Pokédexes all willy-nilly. I will not be exceeding the number of Pokemon entries in the Hoenn Pokédexes that currently exist. So, the Emerald Gen 3 Dex has a total of 202 entries, and it's gonna stay that way. Essentially, this means that if I'm going to add a Pokemon to the Pokédex, I have to remove another to maintain the total 202 number of entries. This also applies to Gen 6. The final segment doesn't really affect the Pokédexes themselves, so anything goes for that part of the video. Rule number 3, you may hear me refer to Gen 1 Pokemon as Kanto Pokemon, Gen 2 as Johto Pokemon, and so on and so forth. I prefer to discuss the generations of Pokemon from their debut regions in this way because it makes my brain happy. Rule number 4, Gen 3 Pokemon are disqualified from being replaced during this overhaul video. That's because they made their debut with the Hoenn region, and I'm not in the dirty business of taking the spotlight away from debut Pokemon. So only Pokemon from prior generations are eligible to be swapped out. Rule number 5, Pokemon will not be swapped out based on strength, competitive viability, or popularity. The decision to swap out Pokemon for the Pokédexes will be determined by whether or not they're a great fit for Hoenn as a region. You may see some swaps of weaker Pokemon for stronger Pokemon here and there, but they aren't being replaced because they're weak. Capiche? Rule number 6. Starter Pokemon, legendaries, or mythical Pokemon will be absolutely off limits and excluded from this exercise. Sorry, Mewtwo, you're staying in Kanto, where you belong. Anyway, that covers all of the rules for this video, so let's get into the Pokédex overhaul. We've got some fantastic new Pokemon that joined us in Gen 3, but there were still plenty Gen 1 Pokemon in the mix to kind of balance out the dex a little bit. Not to mention, with the release of Emerald, more Gen 2 Pokemon that made their debut in Johto were also added to the dex, specifically with the implementation of the expanded Safari Zone. However, I do think that there are some Gen 1 Pokemon that could easily be swapped out for better options. For example, Goldeen and Seaking don't really add much to the region of Hoenn. I know they're based on goldfish or koi fish, and that certainly fits Hoenn's tropical and aesthetic themes, but I think that Remoraid and Octillery would be an even better fit. Of course, Goldeen and Sea King are freshwater species, so there may be some location-based diversity issues, but I think this can easily be remedied by making Corphish or Barboach available with the Old Rod in all of the locations that Goldeen would normally be found. Next up, I think that Voltorb and Electrode don't really do much for Hoenn either. I get it, they're based on Pokeballs and have their little gimmick of, hey, look at me, I'm a valuable hidden item, just kidding, self-destruct. But this has already been played out quite a bit, and it doesn't add much to the immersion of the region for me. Sure, they provide a little electric-type diversity to the region, but I think Electrike, Manectric, Plusle, Minun, Magnemite, Magneton, Chinchou, and Lantern do it way better. So, how about we remove them from the decks and replace them with Execute and Executor? Executor is such an awesome fit for this tropical locale, and while an additional grass type isn't necessarily necessary, I think the Psychic type edition is pretty nice. Plus, this Pokemon just couldn't be more aesthetically suited to Hoenn, in my opinion. However, this kind of leaves a gaping hole in the encounters department as far as new Marvel is concerned. I think we just make Plusle and Minun available there to compensate. Next, let's discuss Hoenn's unnecessary poison types in Grimer, Muck, Coughing, and Wheezing. Hoenn already has an abundance of poison types with Dustox, the Zubat line, the Tentacle line, the Oddish line, Roselia, the Gulpin line, and a Seviper. The Grimer and Coughing lines just don't add any additional flair to the region other than potentially being byproducts of the volcanic activity happening there. But we already have other Pokemon that fit the volcanic aesthetic well enough to where we just don't need these particular poison types. I say that we replace Grimer and Muck with Mankey and Primeape. Hoenn is literally covered in trees, and its tropical aesthetic fits these angry little monkeys perfectly. I could totally see these Pokemon swinging from the trees all over the region. Though, one of my members, Malevolent Minun, did suggest that we should add Magmar into the region to give someone like Flannery a little more fighting power. Of course, Magby would have to come along with it. They did also suggest that this be swapped for Staryu and Starmie, but I'm a little biased in their favor. I've always loved Staryu and Starmie's inclusion, but I wouldn't mind trading Grimer and Muck for Magby and Magmar. They would also make for good additions to the Hoenn decks. As far as Coughing and Wheezing are concerned, I think they could easily be replaced with Onix and Steelix. These rock types could easily be found, maybe not inside, Mount Chimney, the desert on Route 111, and in the mini caves around Hoenn. Granted, we already have rock and steel types in the Aron, Lairon, and Aggron line, but I don't see any issue with adding two more that also fit Hoenn particularly well. However, Malevolent Minun also suggested that Smoochum and Jinx be brought to Shoal Cave to give Hoenn more ice-type diversity, and I can't really argue with that. Hoenn does desperately need more ice types, and this could also help out Glacia's team in the games too. So if you're not a fan of Onix and Steelix being added to the roster in place of Coughing and Wheezing, I think Smoochum and Jinx could be great replacements as well. There's one line of Pokemon in Hoenn that I think just do literally nothing for the region, and that line would be Igglybuff, Jigglypuff, and Wigglytuff. I'm sure that Game Freak just wanted to give us more options to utilize the Moonstones found in the region outside of just for Skitty, but honestly, the Jigglypuff line doesn't fit the region any better than Rattata or Pidgey would. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's not a bad fit per se, but I think I have 3 other Pokemon that are even better for Hoenn. These would be Scyther and Caesar. This tropical locale should be absolutely teeming with powerful bug types, and I think these two are a match made in heaven for Hoenn. But we're still left with one dex entry available, and I think that should go to Mantine. Sure, Hoenn is already chock full of water types, but Mantine should absolutely be found in Hoenn's waters, hands down, no questions asked. This flying manta ray would fit perfectly on the straightaway water routes like Route 132, Route 133, 134, 105, 106, 107, and 108, not to mention how cute would it be for the beachgoers of Route 109 to visit the beach just to see the Mantine flying through the air. I think these 3 Pokemon add so much more to the immersion of Hoenn as opposed to Igglybuff, Jigglypuff, and Wigglytuff, don't you think? And since I've just added a water-type Pokemon to the dex and just admitted that Hoenn already has a ton of water types, how about we take 2 of them out? Those 2 being Psyduck and Golduck. Psyduck can only be found in the Safari Zone, and I'm assuming that Hoenn's Safari Zone is supposed to contain Pokemon from Kanto and Johto to add more diversity to the roster, but of all of the water types that they chose, they decided to go with 2 water types that I don't think really add much to Hoenn overall. Since I've already added a water type that I think is basically perfect for the region, I say we should replace Psyduck and Golduck with Misdreavus and Yanma. Misdreavus is kind of a stand-in for Yanmega, who can't be added to the Gen 3 Pokédex because it hadn't debuted until Gen 4. That'll be an addition for the Gen 6 Pokédex. So instead, I decided to go with Misdreavus for Gen 3, simply because in Gen 2, it was a single-stage Pokemon, and it could add an extra Ghost-type option to the Gen 3 roster. This could have additional implications for Phoebe in the Elite Four, and also trainer types like the Hex Maniacs around the region. And that's pretty much it for the Gen 3 Pokédex changes. Let's move on to the Gen 6 Pokédex changes, shall we? Gen 6 pretty much kept the Pokédex relatively the same from Gen 3. The changes basically consisted of additions from Gen 4, mainly to the evolutionary lines of previously existing Hoenn Pokémon. Gallade, Probopass, Magnezone, Budew, Roserade, Dusknoir, Chingling, Rhyperior, and Frostlass were all added to the Gen 6 Pokédex and were essentially the only Pokémon that were added, totaling out to 211 dex entries for Oris. Additionally, none of the Pokemon that were added to the Gen 6 Hoenn Dex were part of an evolutionary line that was swapped out, so they won't really be subject to this video or to the Pokédex changes. That being said, I'll likely just end up swapping out the same Pokemon that were previously swapped out from the Gen 3 Dex. However, there are more Pokemon options for replacement with Generations 4, 5, and 6 being available, considering that X and Y came out prior to Oris. Plus, there are other evolutionary lines not mentioned previously that could easily be swapped out. But they weren't because they fit the region well enough, and a replacement from Gens 1 and 2 wouldn't necessarily be better for the region of Hoenn. But let's take a look at the Gen 6 Dex and see which Pokemon could be swapped out maybe a little differently. There are a few Pokemon that were discussed in the Gen 3 section that are kinda non-negotiables even for the Gen 6 replacements. Those would be the exchange of Goldeen and Seeking for Remoraid and Octillery, Voltorb and Electrode for Execute and Executor, and Psyduck and Golduck for Yanma and Yanmega as opposed to Misdreavus in this situation. And finally, Igglybuff, Jigglypuff, and Wigglytuff should still be swapped for Scyther, Scizor, and Mantine. Mantine is a must, hands down. Now, on to the other changes I'd make to the Gen 6 Dex. Let's start by discussing an evolutionary line that wasn't mentioned in the previous section. Geodude, Graveler, and Golem. I think they fit the region well, they certainly fill the rock ground slot just fine, and are acceptable encounters for the caves around Hoenn. But what if we replace them with Gible, Gabite, and Garchomp? This ground dragon trio would be such an interesting addition to the Gen 6 roster, especially for the desert on Route 111. I simply think Gible, Gabite, and Garchomp are perfect for the region that literally introduced deserts, even if these Pokemon didn't appear until later. In my opinion, this evolutionary line is kind of a no-brainer for Hoenn. Next, I think that Grimer and Muck could be replaced by Hippopotas and Hippowdon for the same reasons mentioned previously. They'd fit the desert of Hoenn perfectly, and I think I'd really like to see their inclusion on Route 111. Coughing and wheezing should be replaced by Darumaka and Darmanitan. If coughing and wheezing are included in Hoenn just to be byproducts of volcanic activity, why not replace them with Darumaka and Darmanitan, Pokemon that seem to fit the volcanic aesthetic really well and could replace the former two Pokemon inside Fiery Path. Plus, I think these two also really mesh well with Hoenn's themes of balance and karma. Next, Doduo and Dodrio haven't been discussed yet, mostly because I think they're fine for Hoenn, especially for the Gen 3 decks. But I think Helioptile and Heliolisk are even better choices to replace these birds. These sun-loving lizards would be a great callback to the fact that there was no day-night cycle in the Gen 3 games, and they'd also provide an additional electric type to the Gen 6 roster. They would likely be found in the desert on Route 111, but I think they could be found elsewhere in the region as well. However, if we're going in that direction, I don't see why Gligar or Gliscor couldn't also be swapped for Doduo and Dodrio as well. They are flying types after all, and fit Hoenn particularly well. Though, Malevolent Minun, a very helpful channel member, suggested that Misdreavus and Mismagius should absolutely be included in the Gen 6 Hoenn decks, and I don't see why not. More ghost types would be awesome for this region. It's a little difficult for me to choose between these three options, so y'all comment down below which do you think is better, Helioptile and Heliolisk, Gligar and Gliscor, or Misdreavus and Mismagius. Or maybe you think Doduo and Dodrio shouldn't be removed from the Pokédex. Y'all let me know, because I have another evolutionary line that I can't decide on which Pokemon to swap them out for, or if they should be removed at all. Those would be Abra, Kadabra, and Alakazam. I love this Psychic type line, and they're fine for Hoenn. I don't have any issues with them at all. However, they could potentially be swapped for other Pokemon that fit the region just as well, if not better. Pokemon like Roggenrola, Boldore, and Gigalith could be great replacements, though I think they'd really be replacing Geodude, Graveler, and Golem, but still 3-stage evolutionary line for a 3-stage evolutionary line. Or even Tympole, Palpitoad, and Seismitoad, though the water and ground typing would overlap with both the Mudkip line and the Barboach line. Either way, they're not a bad choice, right? But what about Tynamo, Electric, and Electros? They kinda seem like they'd fit the Hoenn region really well. They'd add more electric type diversity, and they're quite powerful. Or we could go the route of Sandile, Krokorok, and Crocodile. Though I feel that I may have already added enough Pokemon to the desert as it is, but they're still a great fit for Hoenn, no doubt. Or maybe y'all like the idea of a Venipede, Whirlipede, and Scolipede. Poisonous bug types in a tropical region sounds like a perfect fit for Hoenn if you ask me. But would they be more perfect than Fletchling, Fletchinder, and Talonflame? This beloved fire-flying combo of an evolutionary line just screams Mount Chimney to me. There are so many 3-stage evolutionary lines that could easily replace Abra, Kadabra, and Alakazam, or Geodude, Graveler, and Golem, but I just can't decide which ones fit best, or if the Abra line should be replaced at all. I'm at a total impasse. Y'all do me a favor and comment down below which evolutionary lines should replace Abra, Kadabra, and Alakazam. Do you like the Roggenrola line? The Tympole line? What about the Tynamo, Sandile, or Venipede lines? Or maybe you just really love Talonflame? Or is the Abra line just good enough to retain its spot on the Gen 6 Hoenn roster? Y'all comment down below. I really want to hear your thoughts. But anyway, that essentially covers all of the changes that I would like to make to the Gen 6 Hoenn Pokédex. All are great choices, but some could be swapped out for others, and some are just such great options that I couldn't choose between them. And amongst those are even more Pokemon that would be fantastic choices for Hoenn that weren't even mentioned as replacements for the current regional decks. Let's discuss those, shall we? In this portion of the video, I am going to be discussing Pokemon that I think are a really awesome fit for Hoenn, but weren't chosen to be added to the Hoenn Dex. And boy, do I have a lot of Pokemon in mind. Hoenn is a tropical region with tons of volcanoes, a desert, grasslands, rainforests, and a metric buttload of water. So generally, Pokemon that I think fit these biomes are kind of automatic shoo-ins in my opinion. In addition, I think floral Pokemon, bug Pokemon, and obviously water Pokemon, flying types, and Pokemon that could essentially survive within volcanoes are great options for this region. Consider this section of the video to be like an extended honorable mentions. There are even more Kanto and Johto Pokemon that would fit Hoenn well that weren't discussed, like Caterpie, Metapod, and Butterfree, Weedle, Kakuna, and Beedrill, Paris and Parasect, Venonat and Venomoth, Poliwag, Poliwhirl, and Poliwrath, Bellsprout, Weepinbell, and Victreebel, and even Lapras, since, as mentioned earlier, Hoenn is kinda struggling with the ice types even if this is a tropical region. The early game bugs kind of fit Hoenn like a glove, and the creepy fungal bugs like Paris and Parasect would be crawling all over the Petalburg woods. Not to mention that the Poliwag line would have been great choices as freshwater species, and the Bellsprout line works well in Hoenn similarly to the Oddish line. So Kanto still has some Pokemon that could make their way into an extended Pokédex of Hoenn. And I pretty much covered most of the Gen 2 Pokemon that aren't already included in the Hoenn Dex, but if the Poliwag line would be a great inclusion, then I can't forget to mention Politoed, who I think would just be downright fantastic for Hoenn. I almost wish it were a single-stage Pokemon so it could be easier to slot into the Dex. Spinarak and Ariados could also fit well into the Hoenn Pokédex. Houndour and Houndoom would also be really cool choices for places like Jagged Pass and Route 112 outside of Fiery Path. And how could I forget Wooper and Quagsire? They would really be awesome for Hoenn, but lest we forget the water-ground typing overlap mentioned earlier. The same issue would apply to Sinnoh's Shellos and Gastrodon. However, I would include them anyway because how awesome would it be to get an East Sea and a West Sea Shellos and Gastrodon distribution across the region? They fit Sinnoh well too, but still, they're kinda perfect for Hoenn. A few other Gen 4 Pokemon were previously mentioned and managed to make a spot for themselves as replacements. But honestly, Carnivine, Finneon, and Lumineon could have made that list easily as well. Generation 5 definitely added a ton of Pokemon that would have been wonderful options for Hoenn. Blitzel and Zebstrika could be perfect for the Safari Zone, Maractus could be soaking up the sun on Route 111's desert, and Fungus and Amoonguss are a better choice for the item Fake-Out gimmick, as opposed to Voltorb and Electrode specifically for Hoenn. Frillish and Jellicent are kinda cooler than the Tentacool line, and I could see the Frillish line replacing them entirely. I still don't know why Luvdisc doesn't just evolve into Alomomola, but that little point aside, Alomomola would thrive in Hoenn's waters. Ferroseed and Ferrothorn could be hanging around the tropical forest on routes 118, 119, 120, and even 121. Heatmore, Durant, Larvesta, and Volcarona would be common around Mount Chimney, Jagged Pass, Fiery Path, and even Route 113 for sure. Gen 5 really had so many other options to choose from rather than the ones I've decided to include, though, I do kinda like my picks. And Gen 6 ain't no pushover either, with Pokemon like Scatterbug, Spewpaw, and Vivian fitting the same bug-type build that the Caterpie, Weedle, and Wurmple lines already fulfill. Flabebe, Floette, and Florges could be great additions to Route 117 near the daycare, what with all of its pretty flowers swaying in the wind. Skiddo and Go-Goat would do well on Hoenn's mountainous terrain, and Noibat and Noivern could assume any cave that the Zubat line could be found in. But Gen 6 offers quite a few water types that I could imagine would absolutely love the region of Hoenn, like Inkay, Malamar, Binacle, Barbaracle, Skrelp, Dragalge, Clauncher, and Clawitzer. Tell me you couldn't see these water types dominating the region. And those are just the unmentioned Pokemon from the generations that could have been great choices for the Hoenn Pokédexes. But what about Pokemon that didn't exist prior to Hoenn? There are tons of Pokemons from Gen 7, 8, and 9 that would also fit Hoenn really well. I mean, basically the entire Alola Pokédex would blend with Hoenn harmoniously since they're both tropical regions. I don't think there's a single Pokemon that was introduced alongside Alola that doesn't exude those Hoenn vibes. Even Crabrawler and Crabominable could be found near Shoal Cave. Maybe Type Null is a bit of a stretch to try to include in Hoenn, but even if you decide to leave that one out, it would be fine. I don't even feel like it's necessary to discuss each Pokemon from Alola that would be a good fit for Hoenn because there's simply too many to talk about. Just go look up a list of Gen 7 Pokemon and you'll see what I mean. Hoenn and Alola are like sister regions, and a fusion of the two would be really interesting to see. Generation 8 also introduced quite a few Pokemon that fit Hoenn's aesthetic and tropical vibes really well, like Gossifleur, Eldegoss, Choodle, Dreadnought, the Applin line, Silicobra, Sandaconda, Cramorant, Arrokuda, Barraskewda, Sizzlipede, Centiskorch, Cursula, and Pincurchin. Sure, there are other options that would work well for Hoenn, but I think these fit the region the best. And finally, Gen 9 certainly introduced some Pokemon that would fit like a square peg into a square hole here in Hoenn. Pokemon like Tarantula, Spidops, Nimble, Lowkix, Squawkabilly, Knackley, Knacklestack, Garganicle, Tadbulb, Bellabolt, Wattrel, Kilowattrel, Bramblin, Bramblegast, Toadschool, Toadscruel, Cloth, Wiglet, Wugtrio, Finizen, Palafin, Orthworm, Flamigo, Veluza, and the newly added evolutions to existing Mons are all such great picks for Hoenn that this region could be bustling with all of these unique Pokemon in an expanded Pokédex. But let me know what you think. Which Pokemon would you like to see replace some of the duds in the Hoenn Pokédex? Are there any Pokemon that you fancy that I didn't mention in this video? And what about replacing Abracadabra and Alakazam? It's a conundrum. Anyway, please leave me your thoughts down in the comments below. If you liked this video, make sure you leave me a like, subscribe, turn on the bell notification because I do upload randomly for my mental health. You can support my channel by earning your Marsh badge today, or you can buy me a coffee or a tea on Ko-fi if you'd like. If you want to keep it nice and simple and here on YouTube, you can just leave me a super thanks if you feel so inclined. I'd like to thank my members Silk Touch Ninja, Malevolent Minun, Sikayo, the Tony458, Yoni42, and Secret Alice for all of your support. Y'all are super snazzy members and y'all are keeping the dream alive. Thank you so much. Anyway, thanks again for tuning in, and I will see y'all in the Ore region review. I'm gonna go hide in my cave, so it's gonna be a little bit before y'all see me again, but it'll definitely be worth it. See you then. Bye!